Bit of an intro. Hi all, and welcome to the reading group. We are this week we have a special guest with us, Andy, who is in Melbourne. He's a well-known around the traps as an old comrade and is a Hegel scholar. Several books under his belt in relation to Hegel and social movements, and he's been working on the capital logic problem and has just produced a new book that he's going to introduce. And as he said, he's going to speak for 25 minutes and then it'll be Q&A after that. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks a lot. Since the publication of Lenin's annotations on Hegel's logic in 1929, all of the Marxists who have tried to show that Marx's Capital somehow mirrors the logic have got it wrong. Unlike every other science, logic has no definite content, being the logic only of human practice in general. All the positive sciences, political economy included, on the contrary, do have a definite content. Claims of a direct relationship between the logic and political economy are therefore nonsense. However, none of the Marxists who have contributed to this debate have bothered to really study Hegel. In particular, the penultimate chapter of the logic in which Hegel explains how he applied the logic in the encyclopedia. I will present an overview of the structure of Marx's Capital. There are many other aspects of Capital, but I'm concerned here only with its structure, which is Hegelian through and through. Firstly, Das Kapital presents the capitalist economy in three layers, each of which is an analytical abstraction, but one which has real historical and social bases, and is characterized by a specific economic ethos. This structure is like that used by Hegel in the philosophy of right, which represented the modern state as the unity of civil rights belonging to all persons, subjects pursuing their own welfare according to morality, and a state whose laws apply to all citizens according to their social position. Right. In bourgeois society, independent producers, whether individuals or companies, own their own means of production and exchange their products at their value, that is, according to the abstract labour time required for the production of each particular commodity, and money singles itself out to play the role of a universal commodity. The producers do not necessarily appropriate a surplus and may stop work once they have produced the equivalent of the necessities for their subsistence. This formation is presented in part 1 of volume 1 of Capital. Bourgeois society originated in towns in the Middle Ages within the interstices of feudal society. Guild masters organized themselves in companies and guilds in which decisions were made on the basis of one man, one vote. These guilds included merchants concerned with the technical business of the circulation of commodities. People must labour, whatever the social form of that labour, and however the surplus labour is appropriated. But exchange determines the meaning of value in its simplest social form, the commodity, and its magnitude, abstract labour time. In productive capitalism, capitalist firms buy and sell their products as commodities. The independent producers of bourgeois society have been split into capitalists and proletarians. The capitalists use the labour power purchased from proletarians who are paid a subsistence wage and forced to work long hours, the surplus of which is appropriated by the capitalists. Capitalist firms sell their products at cost price plus profit, profit being proportional to the total capital turned over in a given period of time. Commercial capital develops as a particular branch of productive capital engaged in the technical business of the circulation of commodity capital and its conversion to money capital. The productive capital is dealt with beginning with part 2 of volume 1, in which the unit of capital is defined, right up to part 3 of volume 3. Part 4 of volume 3 deals with commercial capital, which exists side by side with industrial capital. Thirdly, finance capital arises out of commercial capital, but is concerned only with the lending of money and trading in various forms of credit. The productive capitalist is essentially transformed into a salaried manager or supervisor of productive capital. Ownership is separated from function, and capital achieves its pure form, lacking any role in production. Just as productive capital reduced the worker to the rank of an instrument, which the capitalist wields in production, finance capital reduces the industrial and commercial capitalist to the status of a salaried employee, of finance capital. Landowning capital has ancient roots, but is transformed into a particular branch of finance capital, also playing no role in production. Finance capital is dealt with in Part 4 and landowning capital in Part 5 of Volume 3. Now, each of the above three layers corresponds to a distinctive economic ethos. In bourgeois society, products are sold at their value. In productive capitalism, products are sold at cost of production plus profit. Finance and landowning capital lend their property, credit or land, at interest without releasing ownership of it at all, and play no role in production itself. Finance capitalists redistribute capital within the bounds set by the total social value. The above three-layered formation represents developed industrial capitalism, now dominated by finance capital. Now, the second structure, productive capitalism, is grasped as a Hegelian syllogism. The immediate production of capital begins by defining the unit of capital in Part 2 of Volume 1, and each capital is analysed as independent of every other unit. Each unit produces commodities, each of whose value is composed of constant capital, the value of means of production consumed, variable capital, the value of labour power consumed, and surplus value, the product of unpaid labour time. The total values of each of these components corresponds to the same components of the total social labour, which can be derived by simple addition because each unit of capital is considered separately side by side. Commodities are sold at their value by each unit of capital. Though competition is not dealt with until Volume 3, the tendency of prices to the average does not affect the total value of each component, only the division of value between buyers and sellers. The division of the total social labour between constant, variable and surplus value is the secure outcome of Volume 1. Nothing which follows in Das Kapital or in real life undermines this conclusion. Volume 2 concerns the circulation of capital. Each of the separate capitals of Volume 1 are now analysed as connected in circuits of value, beginning and ending with the sum of money capital advanced for production. Simple passage from money capital, purchasing input for production of commodity capital, sold and returning an expanded quantity of money capital, in turn converted into productive capital. This value circuit cannot on its own recreate all the conditions for the continued accumulation of capital and an ongoing form of life. It is not enough that value must complete the circuit from money capital through production to commodity capital and conversion back into money capital. Each of the particular concrete forms of labour and components of capital must likewise be renewed. The unit on which Volume 2 is based is the circuit of a single capital, like the unit defined in Part 2 of Volume 1, but now including production and circulation within the unit. Each component part of the production process, including all the machinery, raw materials and labour power, must be renewed, as well as all the diverse artefacts and activities which are realised as equivalents of the surplus labour appropriated in production, activities without which the capitalist social formation cannot exist. This circuit, beginning and ending with money capital, is the universal circuit of capital and must be accompanied by the particular circuits of commodity capital, recovering a stock of commodities of all kinds, approximating in abundance to the demand for each, and of productive capital, the maintenance, repair and upgrading of machinery, acquisition of new supplies of raw material, and the needs of the workforce duly met for a new cycle of production. In addition to these three units, the circuit of commodity capital must be divided into circuits corresponding to constant capital, the subsistence products for the life of the workers, and the luxury consumer goods of the capitalists themselves, the latter called Department 1, Department 2. Note that the mediated logical division of the subject matter set out by the foregoing accords with Hegel's requirement that each unit must first be analysed on its own before it is mediated through its relation with other units. However, the different capitals are still taken as if completing the circuit as independent units of capital, as if the renewal of all its components was the work of each unit acting separately. Volume 3 concerns the process of capitalist production as a whole. The circuits of capital now no longer act side by side independently of one another, but act upon one another. The social capital is taken to be an integral whole, with each unit of capital acting upon the others through the commodity market and the capital market. Specifically, this means that the surplus value appropriated from unpaid labour by each of the capitals is shared amongst the units of capital in proportion to the size of each capital, whether or not they be productive. This sharing of surplus value affects the equalisation of the rate of profit on capital. Products and are accordingly sold at cost price plus profit, profit being calculated according to the general rate of profit. Part 3 of Volume 3 completes the conceptual reconstruction of industrial capital as such. Volume 3 continues the examination of the process whereby productive capitals share their surplus value to include the sharing of surplus value with finance capital and landowning capital. The schema used in the foregoing part of Das Kapital, in which the total is determined before the sharing of this total, is repeated in the relation between productive capital and finance capital. No new surplus value is produced by finance capital or landowning capital. So now I come to the third structure in Das Kapital. I've thus far presented the two major arcs of synthesis to provide an overall picture of the structure of the whole work before moving to the detail. However, before it is possible to synthesize, one must analyze. In line with Hegel's requirement, the detail of Das Kapital is composed of the identification of a series of 15 novel units or germ cells, each followed by the identification of a contradiction within the unit and the development of that contradiction. I say novel because each unit represents a unique insight into the structure of the subject matter, with each successive unit arising out of the foregoing exposition. Marx's division of Das Kapital into parts, each containing several chapters, corresponds to the exposition of each of these units. It is this structural layer which will be new to most Marxists, but it is the basic to the whole of Hegel's encyclopedia. Marx differs from Hegel in that Marx uses a genealogical approach to economic history in combination with immanent critique of political economy to determine each of the units or germ cells, whereas Hegel claimed to rely exclusively on logical analysis of the data of the sciences. The unit constitutes the content of each part. Any positive science differs from the logic in having a definite content which is presented in the unit which makes the starting point of the science and constitutes its content. The logic, however, begins from an empty concept. Once the entire field of phenomena is analysed into units, both universal and particular, the above synthesis reconstructs the whole. So I'm now going to go through the 15 units. Das Kapital begins with the commodity, Volume 1, Part 1, the simplest social form of value. The commodity is the foundation of the whole work in the sense that the whole of Das Kapital is concerned with the transformation and distribution of value in a series of different forms. The concrete concept of value is thus produced by the identification of these forms and their logical succession. Each commodity is a particular kind of labour. Use value and its magnitude, exchange value, is abstract labour time, being the socially average time required for the production of the given use value. Exchange value is more fundamental than price, which is but the appearance of value, affected by a multiplicity of social conditions manifested only when the commodity is exchanged. The substance of value is therefore abstract labour time, whatever the form of value. The universal commodity is money. The contradiction within the commodity is that the need of the user served by the use value on one hand, on the other hand the seller's wealth constituted by the exchange value, each belong to distinct processes. While this contradiction provides the engine which Adam Smith identified as the great organising principle, the two processes inevitably come into conflict and prove to be antagonistic. The embryonic unit of capital in Volume 1, Part 2 is an individual capitalist who buys in order to sell more dearly. The individual capitalist, Mr. Moneybags, develops into a capitalist firm. The universal form of capitalist firm is the industrial capitalist and exists alongside the continued existence of the merchant capitalist and the usurer. The capital is a unique form of value which can arise neither within circulation nor outside circulation, but must be continuously put into circulation and withdrawn again. The universal form of capital is industrial capital, which employs labour power and expands its magnitude by appropriation of surplus value from the labourer. The unpaid labour time, Volume 1, Part 3, worked every day by the labourer over and above the time necessary to produce the equivalent of their day's subsistence, is appropriated by forcing the labourer to work longer hours. This is the surplus value acquired by the industrial capitalist. All the surplus value accrued by the total social capital and subsequently redistributed among the various sectors of the capitalist class and subsequently shared with landowners and finance capitalists is equal to the total of unpaid labour time of all workers involved in the social production process. In the same part of Volume 1, Marx defines second-order units, which are the three component parts of capital: constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value. Unpaid labour time is the bone of contention between the two classes, workers and capitalists. The necessary labour time, Volume 1, Part 4, is the time required by each worker on average to produce the equivalent of their daily needs. Its significance is that the progressive development of productive forces by productive capital tends to continuously reduce this necessary labour time, which constitutes the share of the total social labour which accrues to the working class. In their individual endeavours to increase profits by increasing the productivity of labour, the capitalists collectively reduce the rate of profit by reducing the value of variable capital. The unit of productive labour, Volume 1, Part 5, arises because, as Marx says, and I quote, "It is no longer necessary for you to do manual work yourself, enough if you are an organ of the collective labourer. Productive labour is not restricted to hands-on production." The industrial capitalist pays the day's wage, Volume 1, Part 6, to the worker for the use of their labour power for an entire working day. Its value is the necessary labour time. Marx analyses this unit to analyse the various particular forms of payment which serve to disguise the nature of the value of the worker's labour power. These are the 6 units defined in Volume 1. In Volume 2 defines a further 3 units. The basic unit of Volume 2, Part 1, is the circuit of value from the form of money capital to productive capital to commodity capital and back to money capital, ready for reinvestment. This universal unit is interlaced with the particular units, being the circuit of commodity capital and the circuit of productive capital. Each unit plays a little part in ensuring the conditions for the renewal of each circuit. Turnover, Volume 2, Part 2, is the time taken for a unit of capital to complete its circuit and return to capital in the same form. The turnover time makes the denominator of constant capital in determination of the rate of profit. The need to put capital into circulation and pull it back out as fast as possible forces the capitalist to try and reduce the turnover time. The unity of circulation and production, Volume 2, Part 3, is the process by means of which the unit of capital circulates so as to reproduce the entire capitalist social formation, not confined just to the circuit of productive capital, which functions as a unit which is generalised here to include the reproduction of all facets of capitalism. Capital must now not only renew itself, but must renew the entire social formation. Finally, there are 6 units derived in Volume 3. The cost price, Volume 3, Part 1, is the portion of the total value of a commodity, which is accounted for by the total capital invested, irrespective of its division into constant and capital and wages. The price of production is the cost price plus profit on the total capital invested. Cost price and price of production are mere appearances and do not correspond to the needs of society for its reproduction. This is the appearance of the economic categories under the rule of capital. The average rate of profit, Volume 3, Part 2, is the total social surplus divided by the total capital invested in a given period of time, such as a year. This rate is jointly determined by the commodity market and the capital market and applies to all units of capital, whether productive or commercial. The rate of profit can be equalized only by industries which are inherently more profitable, cross-subsidizing those sectors which have a large quota of constant capital to sustain or a long churn over time. This happens by commodities being sold above or below their value and by the movement of capital on the capital market, while the total value of social production remains fixed. Accumulated constant capital, volume 3, part 3, is the mass of material and machinery which the capitalist has accumulated and must be engaged in production. Marx demonstrates that the drive to increase the productivity of labour inevitably leads to a disproportionate increase in this mass. Therefore, with the increase in the rate of surplus value, the absolute value of profit grows, but its proportion to capital advanced, the rate of profit, tends to decline. Here, the fundamental contradiction between production for profit and production for human needs is manifested. The commercial capitalist, volume 3, part 4, is a capitalist firm which buys in order to sell more dearly, but deals solely with forms of credit arising in the circuits of capital. The activity of commercial capital in its pure form is speculative and does not contribute to the creation of surplus value, social surplus at all. The finance capitalist, volume 3, part 5, is a capitalist firm which does not exchange commodities but lends money capital without releasing ownership of it and charges interest for the use of money capital. This is the universal form of finance capital. Particular forms of finance capital include those firms that hire out the use of infrastructure, such as platforms like Facebook or networks like Starlink, on the same basis. In finance capital, function is divorced from ownership. The interest of finance capital in the expansion of credit serves only as a burden on the back of productive capital and the source of new class antagonism. The private landowner, volume 3, part 6, is a unit which plays no part in production whatsoever but charges a levy on productive capital by means of its monopoly control of land. The private landowner is a redundant class surviving only on the basis of an inherited monopoly of land. This completes the 15 units resulting from Marx's analysis of modern capitalism, which are synthesized in Das Kapital as described earlier. So that's all of my talk. I'd like to hear what you make of it. I'm sure you're all familiar with the terms. I'm reading it as if I'm talking to people that have never read Capital, but the point is the only way I can clearly put across the structure is by actually going through it, not describing in an abstract way, but actually naming the structure that Marx has.
No worries. Thank you, Andy. That's plenty to think about there, I have to say. It'll have to take me a while to go over all of that. Look, there are a couple of new people, and I'm not sure about everybody's level, but yeah, just the speakers list. Just put your hand up. Use the thing, and try not to. I'm speaking mainly to new people. Like, try not to make speeches, right? Just get say what you have to say to make the question that you want to ask clear, and then we'll have a discussion. I'm not expecting this to be a problem. Just Hegel, I guess, may require a little more introduction to the question. So, who's going to put their hand up first? George.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Hi. First of all, we have to thank you for this nice and concise presentation that, in effect, is a kind of prospectus of the whole 3 volumes of Capital, and a very, very good idea of connecting and emphasizing the transition from one volume to the second to the third. I have 2 questions, or rather 2 comments and a question. The first is that in your opening remarks, you presented finance capital as being overloading or being dominant over productive capital. We know by Marx analysis that finance capital is subordinate to industrial or productive capital, since interest interest-bearing capital gets its interest out of the profit produced in the production process and accruing to
Wait, take a cab. It's probably better.
Could you mute everyone except for who's speaking, please? Because people keep getting interrupted. Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, George, I can't find that.
You can just mute everyone and then we can just unmute ourselves.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
There's the
Just about
offending person.
So,
okay, can I respond to that point?
Okay, let me raise the question. So my question is, do you see a kind of qualitatively new relationship between finance capital and industrial capital, or can we interpret this kind of surface appearance of finance capital being dominant, a kind of inversion between essence and appearance?
I understand. It is upside down, isn't it? We know that the workers produce everything, and yet they are enslaved, in a sense, and not literally. The dominant force between the capitalist and the worker is the capitalist, and Marx gives a graphic, a very graphic description of walking into the factory and how the person bows their head because they know they're surrounded now by what is the property, what the capitalist controls. So the master is the capital, but the worker does all the production. Now, Marx is quite explicit in the part where he deals with the finance capitalist. He says finance capital reduces the industrial capitalist to the status of a paid employee. The industrial capitalist, he's the one that cracks the whip, designs all the technology, supervises, does all the business of acquiring surplus value, extracting it. But the finance capital is dominant. The finance capital does rule, and the language Marx uses reduces the industrial capitalist to the status of an operative. An operative, being, that's another word. If you're an Italian, you'd recognize that as the word for a worker. In the eyes of a finance capitalist, the capitalist businessman, so to speak, is no different than the operative on the factory floor. They're all just there to pay off the interest and aggrandize his wealth. And it doesn't cost him anything because he never lets go the money that he puts forward for production. It always remains his own property. So, yeah, that's it. It's irony. The most unproductive class, the finance capitalists, are in fact the ruling class. But that's the same. Before finance capital came along, the unproductive class was Mr. Moneybags, who never produced anything, but he was the one that called the shots. I mean, we wish it weren't so, but capitalism is an upside down, social formation.
Any other questions?
Okay, I'll make the second point later.
Okay. Well, okay, Liz?
So thanks so much for your talk. That was so interesting. So did I hear you correctly when you said that the concept differs in Marx and Hegel because you have the material substance supplied in terms of essence for the concept in Marx, but in Hegel it's empty, so it has to be determined. I'm just thinking of the phenomenology and the part where later Jean-Paul Sartre misunderstands him because Hegel says, I think he's talking about forces. It's very early on in the phenomenology, and he says that the concept's sort of undetermined as yet. And then Sartre takes that and runs with it and says, well, if something isn't being, if something's empty, not being, then it has to exist as a nothing. And Sartre then tries to elaborate in being and nothingness, what is nothing. But Hegel never really intended that. That's a complete misunderstanding of what Hegel meant. He just meant, as yet, there is no conceptual ordering of best guesses of what a substance might be or what reality in front of him might be.
I think of it as being in a train driving at night, and you're gazing out the window and you begin to see shapes going by. And
Yeah.
slowly you realize that you're coming into town. So it's that moment when you're just seeing shapeless movements outside the window. That is it's nothing at first. It's not any particular thing, but it's something. But no, look, it's not. Sartre has his own philosophy, and that's fine. He's a great guy. He's made his contribution, but let's not mix up Sartre with the relation between Hegel and Marx. It's
No. My question was: were you saying that the concept differs in Marx and Hegel primarily because the concept starts off empty in Hegel, but in Marx it's always got material substance from the get-go?
No, I'm not saying that.
Sorry, what were you saying?
Firstly, the principle of generosity is a wonderful principle. When you're dealing with a philosopher or any other person, really, and what they're saying seems to be nonsense, not make sense to you, you try and think of a generous way of interpreting what they're saying. Now, Hegel was a great thinker, and he wrote an encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences. He tried to sum up all the science of his day, primitive as it was from our point of view. And he was perfectly aware that there's a material world out there that is there whether you like it or not, and it's a question of understanding it. But what you've got in the logic is not a model for the sciences. It's logic. But when you say, well, logic, what is implied is what is it a logic of, right? Now, this Hegel never explains. He just takes it as given that we know what logic means. But as Marxists, we would, I think, easily agree that what the logic is the logic of human practice in general. That's a reasonable explanation that I've found makes quite consistent way of understanding what Hegel's talking about. But he would never say such a thing. He would just talk about logic, right? But the logic necessarily begins from an empty concept being, which is nothing, becoming, and so on, because it's logic. But capital is not logic. So the second last chapter of the logic, before you get to the absolute idea, it's called the idea of cognition, right? And it's in this chapter where Hegel explains how the logic is applied in the sciences. And it's a tedious and difficult chapter to read, like a lot of Hegel is. And the real meat of it all comes in a couple of paragraphs after you start at about page 800, and about page 830 or something, you get to the meat of it. But what it is, you analyze the whole field of phenomena into the little tiniest bits you can that are something, and then you take some phenomena that you want to understand, some problem, and then you work on that. So you first analyze everything down into little bits, and then you pick out this thing, and then you build up in a logical way from that one thing. So he builds up an idea of space by starting with a point, and he introduces a line, a surface, and a volume. So he doesn't start off with space. This space, I mean, where do you go with a concept like space? It's just an abstraction. But he says, well, what we're really talking about here is, and he starts with a point. And this is what Marx does with capital. He doesn't, like when he writes to Grundrisse, he tries to go straight in with these big generalizations to understand the whole. But then he abandons that process and starts with the 1859 contribution, etc., which was the real first draft of Capital, beginning from the commodity, just as when Hegel writes the philosophy of right, he just begins with private property, including bodily autonomy. And out of that idea of the basic right to own property, he builds up the entirety of civil law. Right? So that was Hegel's approach. You try and find the simplest thing, which it unfolds like a germ cell into a whole area of phenomena. And Marx learned from the first thing when he withdrew to his study, from resigning from the Neue Rheinische Zeitung and withdrew to his study. the first thing he read was the philosophy of right, and he wrote some notes, which he was very pleased of. But the early part of those notes haven't come down to us. But you can see the structure he introduced into Capital is based on the same tripartite structure of the philosophy of right.
But do you not think that they differ because the contradictions apparent in the commodity are actual contradictions in Marx, whereas Hegel deals with contradiction in a sort of conceptual, a sort of like conceptual skeleton almost. He uses them as sort of conceptual in a conceptual instrument. He's not identifying material contradictions. That is apparatus is removed to the conceptual sphere. In Marx, it remains in the material sphere, and Marx adduces it from there.
Marx made important methodological advances from Hegel, right? But Hegel was part of that German idealism, began with Kant, classical German philosophy, began with Kant, and they called themselves idealists because looking at the development of science from Copernicus and so on onwards, tied up with all these irreconcilable contradictions, sort of between dogmatic assertions and skepticism. Kant famously said he read Hume and thought, well, how is science possible if this is right? So that you had a generation or several generations of philosophers resolve that. So they're tackling the problem of basically what forms of thought can we have in order to understand the world scientifically. But they're not suffering from the illusion that the world's all thought. The thing is, there's a beautiful passage in the
just the contradiction in the dialectic, not that the world doesn't exist, just the issue of dialectical contradiction.
Of course, that he in a sense reduced the problems of existence to problems of logic. That is to say, you had to sort out the way these concepts science used in order to be able to talk coherently about things like consciousness and reality and so on. And Marx fully accepts that logic and adopts it. It's his. But there are important methodological innovations he made over Hegel. So he's no longer an idealist in that sense. He criticizes both materialism and idealism. And as I'd say, the way I sum it up in the book is the three strings to Marx's bow. One of them is Hegel with his logic and so on. The other is the critique of political economy, or whatever science you're in, the critique of the existing science. And the other thing is history, but not just history in general. Marx studies history, what I say is more like genealogy. That that little bit in chapter 1 of Capital, I think the 3rd section, where he traces the development of value through history, but it's not real history. It's not actually done a historical investigation, but he shows how this one concept develops from a very, what to put it, abstract thing through to money, right? And he tackles all the problems that way. Now, that's different to the way Hegel proceeded. Hegel proceeded by trying to write an entire encyclopedia, all of which was linked together logically. And the starting point of one science arose out of the previous science. But that's a task, for one person to rewrite the whole of science is an impossibility, and no one tried to repeat it after him. So there are differences, but the differences are not crazy things, Hegel really understood, that there was a world and whatever, and the contradictions existed in the world. They weren't just figments of bad thinking, which Kant seemed to think.
Like, for example, the master and slave dialectic in phenomenology, when people have interpreted the historical stages as Stoicism's French Revolution and sort of applied those to understanding the phenomenology. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Elizabeth. We could go on forever, but we have a bit of a queue going. So
Yeah. Okay.
Wiley is next.
Wiley's next, and then Jeff.
Unmute yourself, Wiley.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You're on.
All right. You started a very good talk, by the way. Very interesting. I read the other work. We put a lot more work on my plate. But the one question I had, you started out by saying that your interest in this began on the basis of Lenin's annotations and the remark that he made, and I've been struggling with it for 30 years, that one doesn't understand capital without understanding Hegel. What is your understanding of what Lenin meant by that based on the work you've done? I know you must have an opinion. What was Lenin talking about? What did he say that a study of science and logic gives you for understanding capital?
Yeah, look, I don't have a finished answer to that. That was, of course, where my study from Hegel began. And unlike other people in that class, I went out and bought a copy of The Science of Logic and The Shorter Logic and reproduced Lenin's underlining in them and tried to go through it. Now, to me, the connection between the logic and capital comes in that second last chapter, right? Which isn't anything like a model. It's simply Hegel's instructions about how to go about the work. And those pages, every page of that chapter, there's substantial bits underlined by Lenin. So Lenin was fully aware of the importance of that chapter. But at the same time, if you look back, presuming the notes that we've got are done in, like reproduced from his notebook in the time in which he, it follows his actual reading process. And his reading process is to read the Shorter Logic on Being, and then the Science of Logic on Being, the Shorter Logic on Essence, the Science of Logic on Essence, the Shorter Logic on the Idea, the Science of Logic on the Idea. So that would have been the last bit he read, and it's the last underlining in his notes. So he said to understand the capital, one must read the whole, in capital letters, italics, of the logic. Consequently, none of the Marxists have understood Marx, he says. So the problem is this emphasis on the whole is good because it tells you've got to actually finish the book and you've got to read the long version to get it as well. But at the same time, it gave the impression that the whole thing is what you need, right? Like again, essence, whatever, and that's led. There are people that got that, and my mentors Vygotsky and Lenkov understood that, and their work was good. But leave them aside because they were in Russia, and they were to be ignored in the West. When the Grundrisse came out in Penguin, in good English translation, suddenly everyone's interested in the relationship between Marx's political economy and Hegel, because it's pretty explicit in the Grundrisse. Now, the relation in Grundrisse is quite different because there are little important methodological observations in the Grundrisse. Lots of gems in there, but structurally, it looks as if he's reading through his edition of The Science of Logic and making comments about political economy as he goes. It's not a first draft of Capital, but people treated this as somehow or other a clue to how Marx is using Hegel. And I don't think that's the case. I can't know, but I think it's more like it was an exercise to try out some arguments and to explore. But the exploration of the relation between logic and political economy is not to write Capital, right? So those two things threw people off, and they started looking for kind of mirrors of the logic in Capital. And then everyone sees a different image somewhere, and it's all in the eye of the beholder. So I can't say what Lenin meant, but he set people looking in the right direction, but not necessarily what he meant in a way he meant to do.
Thank you.
Jeff.
Shane, did my hand go down?
Yep.
Okay, good.
You're on, Jeff.
Sorry, you want me to speak?
Yeah.
I'm very tentative because I read your Capital Logic book, the boring one you call it, found it interesting, but I'm trying to grasp this new thing that you're doing. I've grown gradually disenchanted with Hegel, to tell you the truth. When I was 20, I grabbed hold of Jerry Healy's pamphlet that you talk about because I was fascinated with Hegel at that time and read it voraciously. But I've gradually grown increasingly dissatisfied. And when I read your Capital Logic book, in my mind, it seems to run contrary to what you're writing here. But that's just in my mind, right? Because I'm just reading these things. I haven't really
Can I get clear, Jeff? When you say my Capital Logic book, you mean the one called the Capital Logic Debate that came out about 6 months ago? Right, yeah. They are. It's very different because I'm just critiquing what people say there, and I'm talking about people that think one's an image of the other somehow or other.
But what I liked about that was your approach, which was that Marx did not just map Hegel's logic onto capital, which struck me about logic is when you're dealing with logic, which is Hegel's idea of absolute thought working itself out. When you're dealing with logic, and you're dealing with political economy, you're dealing with two extremely different animals. And therefore you can't just map one onto the other. And I liked that. But though I didn't agree with all of it, but when we come here, it seems like you're mapping Hegel's general philosophy onto Marx, and maybe I'm wrong there. You were saying through.
I'm saying Marx's sort of Capital should have been one of the books of the encyclopedia in a way, right? He's taking Hegel's advice on how to do science, but there's nothing you'll find in anywhere in Hegel that's like labour time or necessary labour time or anything like that. These are all unique insights that Marx got through his combination of his critique of political economy, which was, that gave him labour time and so on, and the history of capitalism itself. Because when proper industrial capitalism arrived in England, it arrived with great big clocks. Suddenly it was all about time. Trains ran on time and stations had this big clock and people clocked in and clocked out. The history of industry just shouted out loud, it's about time, because I tell you, in the old artisans in the villages of medieval England, they didn't work to the clock. I tell you, they did not. They did what was necessary to live and then they went home.
So you're agreeing with your first book that Marx isn't mapping Hegel onto capital.
Mapping Hegel, he's taking Hegel's advice. If you think of what Hegel's doing, Hegel writes the logic, right? And that is the first book he writes. I mean, I don't count the phenomenology, right? He writes the logic, and then he does the philosophy of nature, philosophy of spirit, philosophy of right, and so on, right? Now, none of those books about different sciences such as chemistry or psychology or social life or whatever are mirrors of the logic. But he says at the beginning of the philosophy of right, the method you'll find in the logic, the method. But he doesn't say, I mean, Tony Smith, for example, insisted to me that the three parts of the philosophy of right must be being, essence, and the concept, right? And I mean, you can make it fit if you really want to, but it's obviously not. I mean, Hegel did not copy himself, and Marx didn't copy Hegel. But Marx did learn from Hegel the method. And I'm not particularly interested in political economy, right? Sorry, guys. I'm interested in a lot of things. I'm more interested in, for instance, organizing, and how the mass of ordinary people can organize themselves to get rid of capitalism. But so what I'm interested in is how you can scientifically, in the tradition of Hegel and Marx, scientifically understand these problems and deal with them, right? And the writing of Capital is the best book to go to and say, hey, look, he learned from Hegel, and I see how he used Hegel. I can use the same method to understand organizing. And I've written a book. It's called The Origins of Collective Decision Making, based on these principles as well. Sorry, Jennifer, I think you'd like to get in.
Hi. So I'm a biologist and I am the least astute of this group on this topic. But I find this all very interesting as a biologist because in biology, right, anytime a gene is invented, it is rarely lost. It often goes senescent and is buried in the genome and then can come up and be used appropriately sometime later in the history of that whole organism's genealogy, right? Whatever it becomes, and I don't mean the same animal, I mean anything in the long game. So the real point there is a gene rarely loses its relevance. It just loses its appropriateness for a particular time. And so when we look at your timeline that you show, right? And I love graphs like that. And as you map both Hegel and Marx, what nuggets or genes from the past could we reclaim, or what do we need to come up with for the next section? Like, how do we move away from, the finance and the property ownership in this movement forward? Like, in other words, is this a discard of everything that comes before, or in your study of all of these different time periods that lead up? Are there words or definitions or concepts that we should reclaim from historical moments in order to help build the new sort of genetic, forgive me for putting all these metaphors in, but the new moment to transcend sort of this mishmash capitalism that we've got ourselves stuck into. So how do we use this genealogy of our time to logically move forward and organize?
Yeah, a couple of things. I really a great admirer of the Owl of Minerva. Do you know what I mean by the Owl of Minerva? The owl is wise enough only to take flight in dusk. In other words, be wary of telling the world what it should be. Right, so I don't want to give you my prediction of how the revolution happening, but I'll be happily able, once it's happened, to sit back and explain it to you. Right? But yes, in biology, you are uniquely placed to understand the philosophical point being made here with these 15 germ cells. The word that Marx actually uses for Mr. Moneybags is, it's a long German word, about 30 characters, so I'll never get it right, but it basically means the grub that grows into a butterfly, right? Whatever you call that, the chrysalis, right? The biology is filled with these things that have some little aspect to them that grows and concretizes, right? So we need to be alert to little things that appear in the world and appear maybe inconsequential, but have a nature which you can say, oh, wouldn't the world be nice like that, right? So round about 2000, there was a high point, at least in where I was, of arguments between people that wanted to make collective decisions by consensus and people that wanted to make collective decisions by majority voting. And in fact, that this is an argument that's been going along for a couple of thousand years. And it occurred to me that in the making a collective decision is the germ cell, the simplest little germ cell of politics. So what I needed to do first was to understand what was this argument about, really, between one or another type of collective decision making, and make that the kind of foundation for understanding the political crisis that we're going through now. So that's the answer, but we really have to keep your eye out for these little what kind of memes or germ cells, and where they're expanded. When you look at something and what's going on here, and you see some little thing, and that can give you a glimpse into the much larger issue, which maybe should be fostered and encouraged to grow. So it is a part way of seeing the world which Hegel gives to us, and Marx is very much attuned to. And was there something else I wanted to say? No, that'll do, because
Can I follow up just
yes,
quickly?
please, yes.
So just out of curiosity, I'm just trying to figure out, is there anything in your study of this history of logic and genealogy that you have found that we should hold tight to in order to set the path forward, right? Like, what part of this capitalist moment has been important in order? I mean, we all know it gives us certain things, but is there anything in either the logic or in the structure that we should be looking to keep in order to build from, or is it just throwing the whole thing away, is really my question.
Well, certainly, I mean, it's given in advance, isn't it? It's never throw the whole thing away. That I noticed that we should learn from the way capitalism organizes, because these are serious people. They're there to make a buck. If they don't get a buck out of it, they don't do it. So you don't find much by the way of Henry Ford type organizing going on. And the socialist equivalent of Henry Ford is world parties of social revolution, right? Where some little group together think they're going to play Henry Ford's thing. They've got a great invention, and they're going to enroll in their factory all these workers who are going to be the members, and then spread it out so it controls the whole world. What a fantasy! And of course, that method of capitalism is already a good 100 years out of date. What capitalists do now is much more like the franchise, right? They allow people to have their own little company, and they just supply some products or a brand name, even just a brand name, and get a percentage out of that. So I think it's worthwhile always looking at innovations in industry and commerce and think, well, what does this mean if what you were doing was organizing rather than making a buck? And as I say, that there's that, and I also put a lot of emphasis on the understanding and dealing with people trying to work together. Put it another way, for me, the core problem of the present day is solidarity. That's a simple principle, is helping someone else according to their direction. So how can I help? Now, how do I help solidarity? If that was universal, you'd call that socialism. Never mind about state forms and nationalizing industry and everything. So some basic sort of principles of helping someone who's struggling according to their requirements, that's the principle of socialism. So I tend to work that way, find those little things which are understandable in an immediate personal sense in order to work for the larger change. Okay, we'll go to Georges.
Okay. I would like to turn back to the connection between Marx and Hegel, especially because, as you have criticized, let's say, in your first book, that there is an attempt by various theories to make correspondences between parts of Hegel's science of logic and Marx's capital. But I want to argue that there is a deeper structural similarity between the two thinkers. Marx, in in the preface of the third volume, Capital, says that the capitalist mode of production is an organic totality.
It's an organic
Totality. It is an organic totality. Okay. Hegel says that the state is ein Organismus. Also, the concept follows life. In other words, the concept is a living activity. Thinking is a living activity. Okay. So my idea is that we have an identity in terms of ontological understanding of reality, that it is organic and it undergoes developmental processes. This is an identity between the two theoretical frameworks, if you like. Okay. So this is something that we shouldn't put aside. And also it gives us something very important, that we shouldn't treat it as a kind of mechanical succession or transition between various points, but we should see it as moments of a developmental process. Whether we refer to the accession of the concept to truth, because this is the basic idea in Hegel's science of logic, how do we arrive at valid truth? Okay. And realize the idea, which is the identity of concept with reality. But the same is true for Marx also, because Marx is a scientist. In his critique of political of economy, he searches truth. Okay, the truth of the capitalist mode of production. So I think this is something very important. This ontological identity between the organic conceptions that we carry, which opposes, if you like, the bourgeois mechanical understanding of social reality that separates reality into independent fixed ideas and then try to find a connection between them. And a second point that I would like to raise concerning the very structure of the commodity. The germ cell, as you have said, the germ cell, the commodity, is a self-contradiction. The two dimensions of use value and exchange value are in opposition. Okay, so this is very important, because for Hegel also, all the movement of the concept is based on internal oppositions of the notion or of the concept. Okay, and the same applies to Marx also. Okay, and actually, in the commodity, we have the clash between two logics. We have the logic of use value, which these are teleological logics, okay, and oriented. The logic of the use value is oriented to the satisfaction of social needs. But the logic of exchange value is oriented to accumulation of value or self-aggrandizement. So it's a self-end. And we have, in other words, we have a clash between these two logics internal to the commodity structure. This is, in a sense, relates with what you said, that in capitalism, I don't use capitalism, I use capitalism mode of production. Production is oriented towards profit, whereas, as you know, in all other historical modes of production was oriented to use value. So again, we see, in a nutshell, this kind of clash between two different logics expressed within the commodity.
Look, you and I think, share an admiration for Ilyenkov and Vygotsky, and in that sense, I'm sure we agree on the idea of a concept as a form of action. It's a living action. That's what a concept is. It contains the ideal form as well as the practical side. And I chose not to write a book about that, but to keep it right down to the structural similarity between capital and its debt to Hegel, and not to fuzz over that question. I'll write about that elsewhere, and I do write about that elsewhere, but to just keep it to the question of the structure, because it's very definite, And most of the points you made there about the contradictions are made in my talk, because I just keep it limited to the structure. But I completely agree with what you're saying about the totality in the organism and so on. Absolutely. Jeff.
My reaction increasingly as I looked at your material was I'm wondering whether it's too structured. First, you've got to remember that Marx's 3 volumes only appear to be a whole in our knowledge of publishing history. The last volume was written before the first volume, remember, and also Marx continued his economic manuscripts after. Volume 3 strikes me as, yes, it's dealing with capitalist production as a whole, but it's a development in a different way than a mere structured working out from germ cells. The germ cell, especially, I'm concerned about, is it discrete? discrete, are they discrete germ cells? Because Marx's method strikes me as one of the inner connections. Now, this may be connected with what George was saying, I'm not sure, because I couldn't fully pick it up. But it might be, I tend to see the connections as being inner connections, and I take the dialectic in the capital as being the same as the dialectic of the logic, insofar as Charles Taylor argued that the post-phenomenology books were a dialectic of categories as opposed to a dialectic of consciousness. But the inner connections develop from the very beginning, from the commodity. So it isn't a question of we solve this problem, let's go to the next. This problem is sorted, is actually developing in a Gestalt sense. So I can't think of it in a sense of...
I kind of respond to that. The quick history again. Jennifer likes me talking about the history. The origin of this germ cell method comes from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe, apart from being a poet and playwright, he was also in charge of mining in his area, and he was a great naturalist. And his works on natural science, the origin of this idea of germ cell. The German word Gestalt is actually quite an ordinary German word. It just means form, but thanks to Goethe, particularly, it takes on this connotation of being a whole. And Goethe's idea was that there would be one part of an organism, he thought it might be the leaf, from which the whole organism could be regrown. Now, I understand there were no microscopes to speak of in his time, but the idea was clearly correct, and we now know that the germ cell, an actual cell, is what he was talking about. Right? Now,
is it that important?
Goethe was a rock star in his time. I mean, literally, he had the paparazzi following him around. He was a rock star of the 18th century, and he was also a member of the nobility. And Hegel had a very admiring but almost fawning relationship to Goethe. He admired him greatly, and he basically could be said to have translated Goethe's poetry, or what is it, the phrase that Goethe. Just give me a second. Beethoven, Goethe, and Hegel. Hegel set Goethe's writing into philosophy. Beethoven set it into music. This is a comment by a historian. So it comes out of biology, out of the idea of a germ cell growing into a whole organism. And the point is, what Goethe showed, in order to grasp something as a whole, you have to actually grasp the smallest part of it. That's how you grasp the whole, right? The totality is in the single thing, which is kind of gets the whole in the nutshell. Now, the logic is written that way. The first book is actually ontology. it was given as lectures, initially lectures on ontology, and it begins with being. And it's the critique of this idea of being which makes up the whole of the first book. The second book, which is usually called Essence, actually is reflection. It begins from reflection. And the whole of that second book of the logic is an analysis of reflection. An existing mind, with all its prejudices and its knowledge and its limitations, reflects on what's happening. So the essence is an examination of the simple idea of reflecting. And the third book, the concept, is a examination and unfolding of the idea of a simple concept. Right? So
Are the
there's
germ cells
nothing
discrete?
mechanical about this.
Are the 16 germ cells discrete from one another?
Yes, they're
So when
discrete.
you want
But
the
the whole
other,
idea, of course, is that when you examine the commodity, you realize that while the commodities exchange at their value, that you have something to sell, but you sell it in order to get something which you want. But you could do it the other way around. You could have some money and think you can buy something and then sell that at a profit, right? So that's the one germ cell arises from the previous one, yeah? And that you'll find that the series of 15 germ cells, on the one hand, they are sort of independent insights into the nature of capitalism, right? But they're not just random. They are sorted in an order, in a succession, so that one follows from the one that goes before. But the thing is to understand something as complex as modern capitalism and the way it absorbs, all the foregoing social formations within it. You can't just do it with one germ cell, because like the single germ cell of the commodity gives you bourgeois society, such as Hegel would have known, the artisans and the cities.
I would say one germ cell is all that's needed, because if you look at Hegel's beginning of the logic, with what then must the science begin, Marx operates in a very different way when he looks at the commodity, because the commodity doesn't automatically go on to who do you sell to, who do you want. He says that the commodity, in order to understand the commodity, we must go back and look at the twofold nature of it, use and exchange value, and realize behind these two are abstract labor and concrete labor. Abstract labor is not abstract labor time. That's how you measure abstract labor. But abstract labor creates exchange value as opposed to the use. Taking this, he then develops it throughout the book.
To stop here, you're arguing against yourself. When you find that germ cell, and it's right in the preface to the first German edition, he refers to the economic cell form as the commodity, right? He uses the word cell, germ cell, the seed, it has different names. And it's the thing is, by analysing that and disclosing the contradictions within it is how the whole science unfolds. And Hegel demonstrates this. I mean, in my book on Hegel, I listed 30 different examples of the germ cell, where he takes a very simple concept and then critiques it and unfolds from it a whole sort of science. And one is not enough to deal with capitalism because it has so many different shades to it. But they're in a string, they're related, they're not independent. Can I give Wiley a go now?
Can I give one the nature of germ cells, really? I'm not denying that he goes to problem to problem to problem and develops it. It's where it comes from at the very beginning. And also what the aim is. The aim isn't to build a general structure of 3 volumes. The aim is to try to understand the dynamics of capital, to lay bare the laws of motion of capital, and to understand the social classes which arise from it. To do that, he starts from the first germ cell, the commodity, which doesn't go anywhere until he starts developing abstract and concrete labor.
Yes, in what I've done, I've left out the historical divergences. Right? I left out the unpublished chapter 6, a wonderful chapter that explains how capitalism begins by just drawing a lot of workers together and extracting their surplus, but then it has to be transformed. Right? It has to, in order to like change the labor process, how capitalism wanted it, had to be changed. But Marx doesn't include that. It is also left out, I think, the last two parts of the first volume, the last part of the third volume, because he has these places where he goes into the history of things. But fundamentally, the structure doesn't include these stories of how it came about. It just gives you the structure. But how he understands them is through an understanding of the history. You have to see how something, as Jennifer said, at a certain point it's just there, and then conditions change, and all of a sudden it flourishes. Right? So under what the exchange of commodities has been around since Pompeii at least, because we've seen evidence of cafes and things in Pompeii, but it didn't burgeon into capitalism till a couple of thousand years later. And what are the conditions which made it possible? This interested Marx, he studied it, but it's not included really in Capital. Capital is like the finished work, right? And the finished work has Hegel's structure. But how he got there, it did involve a study of history, of course. That's one of his differences from Hegel, who was interested in history, but he doesn't derive the concepts of philosophy of right, for example, historically. Wiley.
Yeah, the discussion, I nearly lost my question following this discussion because it related to exactly what you're talking about. But let me try to recapitulate what I was thinking. One, I wanted you to speak more, two things. I wanted you to speak more to make sure I understood you correctly of this whole concept of the germ cell is at the core of scientific inquiry. Am I correct in that assumption? That's the way I tend to look at things, but to hear it stated, as I think you stated, is important, so I really want to understand that. Secondly, I think you already touched upon this, that question of germ cell, that while it certainly has its qualitative distinctiveness, it does transition from a lower to a higher stage, to put it that way. So history is a process of evolution of germ cells, as it were. So those are two things, namely that the transitional nature and the centrality of the germ cell concept to science. Finally, one of the things where it seems to come for me, as one studies, is in the chapter on exchange in volume 1, where it seems to me that he's talking about the historical evolution of the germ cell in and through the process of exchange. But I'll stop there. My first point was the centrality of the concept to science. That's the most important point for me.
Yes, the first thing I'd say is the germ cell was certainly, it's the theme for Hegel. The whole of the encyclopedia is made up of unfolding sciences out of germ cells. You're right to draw attention to the little third section of the first chapter, where he actually does that historical process of showing a germ cell as a commodity, just exchanging one thing to another, how that leads through history, when conditions come right, to singling out one commodity alone to be money. Now, that was important because the alternative was to do what the political economists did, is just posit money from the beginning. You know, you've got commodities, you've got labor, you've got a fixed general rate of profit, and you've got money. And if you start off with all those different concepts, then stitch them together in some theory, you can't really understand it. So what Marx did instead is he just started with the commodity, and he derived the other components of political economy, just beginning with that one germ cell. And the way he did it, first thing he had to do was to show how money was, if you like, just a commodity. It wasn't just a commodity, but it grew out of commodity exchange. Now, Shane's got something to say. You're still muted.
You're muted, Shane.
Yep, yep. I try to go a bit last in these things, but since there's not a lot of hands up, yeah, I was sort of, it's really hard when you're just hearing someone speak off the top, but I was just interested in the way, I don't know whether you want to call them germ cells, but different, the way Marx, the method that he uses to approach things. And there's a whole debate, say, about the way we can derive a theory of the state from capital, because, they just sort of dismiss the early work and say that doesn't, that's immature or whatever. Because there was that plan, for the 6 volumes and all that. And I'm wondering, what reflection you might have on how that would be done. Like, how would you go about saying writing the book on the state, or writing the book on the world market, or in terms of that method? Yeah.
People would know Geert Royton. He unfortunately died quite recently, but he wrote one of the books I deal with in the first book, and he claims to write the book of the capitalist state, to write a book which simultaneously deals with the economy and the state. Now, it seems like a great idea, but it's a mistake, because the state has its own origins. The state was around before capitalism, and it arose out of different conditions, if you like, driven by different requirements. Then capitalism came along, and then it grew up within capitalism. So capital grew from bourgeois society, which existed under the state, feudal states and so on, sort of more or less controlled by it. But then, of course, it grew. So then capitalism took over the state, and you had a merging and subordinated the state. So you now have a capitalist state. But the state is still a distinct entity. It's not just a creature of capital. Now, Trump is, of course, trying to change that by transforming the USA state into to capture it. And this word state capture expresses the fact that, one, it's a disaster, and two, there has to be something to capture. And so by setting off on the assumption that the state and capital arise from the same preconditions, and he does it by the odd and even chapters, bouncing backwards and forwards between the economic categories and the political categories. It looks very pretty, but can I put it? It's a product of nice writing. It's nothing to do with reality, because the state exists independently of capital. It's quite capable, if you've got the guts and you've got the political movement, organised working class, to discipline capital. It has its own reasons. Yes, Cynthia.
You're muted.
Muted, Cynthia.
Gotcha.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, can.
Fascinating. All of this is fascinating. I wanted to ask you, please, to speak more about the germs of that arise in social activity, in the your interest in collective activity, and you spoke, if I understood it correctly, about saying there is a germ in the question of decision making. That was very interesting to me, this question of the one that arose between majority and consensus. And then as you continued, you spoke about the germ within capitalism of collectivization, or the activity that capital undertakes to bring workers together in a way that they hadn't been before, and thus out of the activity of capitalism or the capitalist mode of production comes the whole concept of collective activity and the ability to take control of your own life. I don't know if that's exactly what you were talking about, but I would appreciate it very much if you would speak more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to. That doesn't quite go as you're expecting, but it's a good question. the book is called The Origins of Collective Decision Making. If you Google that, you'll find it, and you can buy it for about $18 if you're in the States. And what I do then, I'm confronted with this problem of the left being unable to unite itself. And the central issue, which was dividing the left, was the division between a sort of anarchisty student type of peace movement side of the left that insisted on making collective decisions by consensus, and the Labour movement was majoritarian and is wedded to majoritarianism from its very beginnings. And there was a huge misunderstanding and mutual suspicion between these two groups. So that caused me to look into it. So I realized, reflecting on the methodology here, that the two or more people in a room together making a decision, a mutually binding decision, is the germ cell of political life. All political life comes out of the two or more people making a mutually binding decision. So that I thought, if I understand this, I'll get a handle on how to approach political life. So, of course, being a Marxist and not Hegelian, I set about it historically. So I had to start from the present moment, my own experience of these different types of decision making, and look back historically to try and find where they originated. And that took me back into Anglo-Saxon England, because I don't just try and do a world summary. I have to work through definite connections, which led my experiences back into Anglo-Saxon England, when you had a different type of decision making, which was called council, as in the king has a council and consults the council, then makes a decision. And then I suddenly realized that council is a very widespread mode of decision making to this very day. In fact, I attended a meeting of the Executive Committee of the Electricians Union and witnessed council in operation. Everyone around the table spoke, and then the General Secretary announced the decision, and they all raised their hand in agreement. Right? Whether they were voting really or coming to a consensus is neither here nor there. And I think Jeff will remember decisions made by this way as well. So there are these three modes of decision making, and that's like a starting point to analyze how to organize. Now, the observation that you related to is all this takes place in the context of the forces of production, for which society creates and recreates itself, the particular stage of development of capitalism. Now, in the time Marx is writing was a coming to be, and especially of Engels, if you look at the later time, of factory labour, where vast numbers of workers were drawn together in a single township, living in these little rows of terrace houses like you find in northern England, and all working, doing similar jobs in the same factory. Now, those conditions create enormous solidarity between workers, right? So the capitalist class, created this thing which was extremely dangerous to it. Now those times are gone. What capitalism does now is it encourages the development of like independent contractors, and it makes its profits by people going off and doing their own little business, but under conditions when the profits are still wrapped up through finance capital. So and that's the condition in which present day workers work. They work as well, not all of them. If they're in the private sector, that's sort of how they work. If they work in the public sector, yes, it's the serried ranks of nurses and teachers. But what's the good of that? Because they're not there making surplus value, they're spending surplus value. So you have to look at the problem of organising in the context of the development of the labour process itself, and the implications for organising are reflected in the the labor process by how the capitalists organize. Right? It's not so that's how we copy them, but there's a running experiment on organizing, and the capitalists have to organize in order to make their profits, and they do it quite differently now than the way they did it in Marx's time, and consequently, if workers want to organize, they're going to have to organize differently as well. So you just have to study that and try and get to the bottom of it.
I just wanted to pick up one comment of yours, Andy, because we started reading these Paris writings in sort of the middle of the syllabus that we decide we're looking at Marx's political writing, and one of them we are going to read, or we have plans to read, is the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And you did mention something about that right at the start, about the pattern or something, or the model being the same. So just to elaborate a bit on that. And
two things about it. The time at which Marx is writing this, he's just been decided that the political work he was doing was pissing into the wind. He had to go back and study political economy and understand how the world works. So he withdrew to his study, and the first thing he started looking at was Hegel's philosophy of right, and he wrote some notes on it. Now, the notes he left are only his observation on the section of the philosophy of right on the state. Now, the way he talks there is not really Marx, in the sense it's the young Marx. It's not the Marx yet that writes the thesis on Feuerbach, right? So, to my reading, the first thesis on Feuerbach is the first words of Marxism. The critique of Hegel's philosophy of right is an earlier Marx. He's a radical, and his critique of Hegel is fine, but it's not a model for Marxism. It's just a model for leftism. But Hegel's work itself, the philosophy of right, it needs to be read. You need to read Hegel. You won't get anything from it by reading Marx's critique of it. One, because he's only studies one section, the section which is of interest, or we only left with his notes on one section of it. He may well have written about the whole lot, but we don't have that. So you can't get the whole picture. And also his critique of Hegel is very one-sided and somewhat immature, and you don't want to read Hegel like that. So philosophy of right is worth reading in its own right.
Cool, thanks for that. Any other question?
Yeah.
Yep.
Elizabeth, you have something?
Comments, questions?
It was just a thank you. Thank you very, very much. It's so late there. I'm very grateful.
It's my pleasure, believe me.
Rightio. Okay, there being no further questions, just big thanks to Andy for taking the time. It was certainly very round of virtual applause.
My hat off to you, your reading, your determination.
Thanks a lot, Andy. And so next week we're on to part 5 of 18th Brumaire. So anyone wants to lead that one, let me know, and I shall see you all next week. Take care.
Wow.
All right.
Thank you.